Back when I was in college, we were at a transition point when it comes to cell phone technology. And I remember one night walking around campus, and there were a couple people, individuals, walking down the street by themselves, and I would see them talking, and I would say hello to them, and they would ignore me. And I would walk by and think, well, that was very strange. Until I realized that they were on their phones. I couldn't see the phone. This was when they had the Bluetooth thing that you would put on your ear, if you remember that. And I had not grown used to this. I just thought, man, they're not very friendly, or what? These are crazy people talking to themselves as they walk around campus all the time. And I think this is an association that we have with talking to yourself. You got to be a little crazy to talk to yourself, and it just doesn't. It's not something normal people do. Enter the last year of lockdown and COVID, and I think a lot of us probably found ourselves talking to ourselves. And maybe we were a little bit crazy, but regardless, it was something that was more common. As the lockdown came, all of our social places were shut down. Restaurants, festivals, dinner parties, family gatherings, all these places we go to be social with one another were gone suddenly. And we scrambled with this void for human connection. I haven't even counted all the apps that I downloaded on my phone that are all built around helping me to connect with others. Zoom, House Party, even streaming services multiplied on our television because we needed something to watch. We needed some sort of human beings to hear their voices and be a part of that. And incidentally, that's not something strange. I've been in many homes of widows or widowers, people who have lost loved ones and are living alone. And a lot of times there's a radio or there's a television on because those things can give us this sense of someone being there. They make us feel less alone. And of course, all of us need that connection, that human connection, to hear other people's voices, to know that we're not alone. But as we look at the essentials that we've learned from the past year that we want to carry forward and say, this is something we want to hold on to. We don't want to just lose this lesson. Our essential this week is being able to be alone. Being able to be alone is an essential practice for us. And we're going to find that talking to yourself is not just for crazy people. In fact, it's biblical. Psalm 42 and 43 are psalms about a person who has, for some reason, been cut off from communal worship, been cut off from the temple where he is used to going to worship with other people. And this leaves him searching for hope in between what one scholar calls past nostalgia and present affliction. Now, does that sound like any of our experiences from the past year, being cut off from people, our worshiping community, and our place of worship, and finding ourselves somewhere between past nostalgia and present affliction? Let's read Psalm 42. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you downcast, O my soul? And why are you disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help. My God, my soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is within me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me while they say to me continually, where is your God? Why are you downcast, O my soul? And why are you disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We hear in this psalm deep longing and loneliness. This is a person who loves God, who is faithful to God, but is feeling like God is in short supply and unable to be found. And not only is he missing God, he's missing the experience of communal worship and festivals, the throng of worshipers and the energy around that. And for many of us, our spirituality is wrapped up in community. And that's normal and that's natural and even good. God has said, my spirit will be among you as you gather. But what happens when that's taken away? What happens when the circumstances of the world mean that we can't be with the worshiping community, with our friends and our loved ones in prayer and singing and scripture reading? We can experience isolation and loneliness and thirst. And so the psalmist calls out to God, but he cannot find God. God is not responding. He doesn't hear the voice. And so he turns somewhere else. If I can't talk to God, if I can't talk to other people, my beloved faith family, where can I go? And he turns to his soul. He turns inward to that deep part in himself. And he says, why are you downcast, O my soul? Scholar Willem van Gemeren says, the inner feelings here express themselves in questions, despair, and hope in God. The questions are overtaking him. Yet while hemmed in by the questions, in his desperate situation, he still could engage himself in dialogue. There was no voice from God. Within me. And friends, that is a great question. You know, a lot of times we scramble when our soul is cast down or bent over. We scramble to prop it up. When we feel empty, we scramble to fill it with something. When our soul is aching, we scramble to medicate it. But instead, the psalmist teaches us that it might be more fruitful for us to have a conversation with ourselves. So have a conversation with the soul that is bent and downcast within us and disturbed. To develop an inner dialogue. Because in that inner dialogue, he finds God. He again says, my God. He finds water, although now it's too much. It's flooding over him. But even here, he says there is love in this. By day, the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song within me, a prayer to the God of my life. This inner dialogue has led him back into conversation with God. And he can be honest. He says, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten about me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? He gives voice to the pain that's within him. Not everything is fixed. Just because he's had this inner dialogue and he's coming a little bit closer to an experience of God, he can address God and say, why have you forgotten me? It's very much like the prophet Elijah in the story we read last week. As Elijah pleads his case to God and says, well, I'm alone in this thing, God. Where are you? The psalmist here, just like Elijah, has gotten into that deep place, that sheer silence through the winds and quakes and fire. And he gets there by engaging himself in dialogue, by talking to himself. And finally, by the end, he can say, why are you cast down? Why are you disturbed? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help. And this is something that's added in the last refrain, although we don't necessarily see it in the text. He says, my help and my God. Right? That God that his soul has been thirsting for, longing for. He says, my help and my God. And so while it may sound sad to us that we would need to talk to ourselves sometime, you know, it seems like, oh, that's something you would do if you have no friends. You know, you only develop a relationship within yourself if you don't have any other relationships. And we say, no. We look at the scriptures and we say, no, this relationship within ourselves is a rich and necessary spiritual practice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who knew a lot about what it meant eventually in his life to be alone and by himself and to feel like he's being overwhelmed by the sorrows and troubles of life, He wrote a book called Life Together. And in this book, it might seem strange, in a book called Life Together, he has a chapter called The Day Alone. And this is what Bonhoeffer writes in this chapter. He says, "Whoever cannot be alone should beware of community. Such people will only do harm to themselves and to the community." And he also says the reverse is true. He says, "Whoever cannot stand being in community should beware of being alone." So he says, we recognize then that only as we stand within the community can we be alone, and only those who are alone can live in the community. Let's reflect on that for a little bit, because I think both of these are struggles for us, being alone and being in community. We are a radically individualistic culture, but we don't like to be alone. And the more options we have to do whatever we want, it seems like the more isolated we become. The more things we can do, the more uncomfortable we are with simply being by ourselves, with ourselves. Right? There's always a phone to turn on. There's always an app to scroll. There's always a website to go on. There's always a show to watch. There's always some project to do. And so, we can talk about the difficulties we have with community, being in community, whether it is our individualism that is always looking for things that cater to our wishes rather than giving ourselves to the interplays of communal mutuality and dialogue and understanding and compromise, or whether it's just how distracted we are with so many things. We could go on for days with the things that keep us from being in community, in true community. But I also think we know we need community, right? We know we need others. We want to be around people at some point. But I'm not sure we really even grasp, many of us, especially the extroverts among us, I'm not sure we all really even grasp the other part of Bonhoeffer's warning about the importance of being able to be alone and to be with ourselves. Now, some of you know the value of this, especially if you're a more introverted type. You kind of get, I need to be alone. But this is what Bonhoeffer says about it. He says, we have to grasp this aloneness. We have to be able to be alone sometimes because God has called you. God has spoken to you individually and directly. You have an individual relationship with God. And that's not how we often talk about it. Sometimes we're just like, it's just me and God. It's all about me and God and no one else. It's no one else's business. No one else can tell me what to do in my relationship with God. Sometimes that's how we talk about it, but that's not how Bonhoeffer talks about it. He talks about how each of us have a kind of individual accountability with God. Each of us has a unique cross to bear. Each of us has unique gifts to offer. Each of us have unique experiences to process and conversations that we need to have with God, just between us and God. All of us have those things. Bonhoeffer goes on to write, he says, you cannot avoid yourself. And that is false in the short term. A lot of us are really good at avoiding ourselves. But ultimately and finally, this is true. We cannot avoid ourselves. Sometimes we go to community and we think that just that socialness, that being social, it can be one way that we try to avoid ourselves, that we've tried to avoid facing our realities and those conversations we have with God. And if we do that, Bonhoeffer says, if we are just going to community to avoid being alone and having those conversations and being accountable with God, if we're doing that, we will bring damage to any community that we're a part of. The less self we allow to be seen and redeemed by God, the less gifts and character we allow the Spirit to grow in us, the less true and honest blessing we are able to bring to the community. Instead, we're just going to be, when we get around other people, we're just going to be bringing our insecurities, our egos, our unresolved issues, and asking the community to fill parts of ourselves that only a healthy relationship with God and self can ultimately fill. And so Ruth Haley Barton puts it this way. She says, the best thing we bring to leadership is our own transforming selves. And I think that's true of community too. So I'm going to say it again with that in mind. The best thing we bring to any community is our own transforming self. A self that is in process with God, that we are developing and cultivating and letting God into. That's what we should be bringing to community if we want to be a healthy presence and if we want to have healthy communities. And so to do that, it is essential to learn to be alone and to develop a healthy inner dialogue. And I want to emphasize that word healthy because many of us have inner dialogues, but many of them are very unhealthy. Maybe your inner dialogue is constantly condemning you and telling you all the ways you don't measure up and are not enough, or all rehashing all the ways you failed or said the wrong thing, right? Some of us, that's our inner dialogue. For others of us, our inner dialogue is all about self-justification and denial. Right? If there's any criticism of us, we're just like, oh, well, we got to cut them off. They're wrong, they're bad, right? For some of us, our inner dialogue is all about propping up our egos. We need to develop a healthy inner dialogue. And so just as we would want our interpersonal dialogues, our dialogues with other people, to be shaped by Christ and the fruits of the Spirit, that's what we want for our inner dialogues as well. Now, that doesn't mean it's polite, right? Sometimes politeness just means not saying what's really going on, right? You don't like that person's hat, and being polite means you don't say it. That's not what we're talking about. In Psalm 42, if we go back there to Psalm 42, there's all kinds of honesty. The psalmist gives voice to his thirst, to his feelings of abandonment. He gives voice to those memories that are painful memories at this point, and he can give voice to hope. And so a healthy inner dialogue is marked by honesty, by love, by compassion, and by curiosity. It's a place where we can genuinely explore what is truly going on within us, and it is a place where God can truly be found. So the inner dialogue is an honest wrestling, a push and pull, all done in the context of our belovedness. Now, again, I feel like I'm going back to college a lot today, but when I was in college, we had these workouts for the baseball team, and one of the stations at our workouts was this big bucket. If you can picture those big buckets you get at Menards or Home Depot, and we had this bucket that was filled with rice. And this exercise was we would put our hands in the bucket, and we would have to dig down and go as deep into that bucket of rice as we could possibly go. And you can imagine your forearms burning in that experience, and they did. And I think that's some of what this inner dialogue is going to be like for some of us as we try to cultivate it. It's this, we go in and we just try and dig down, and we can only go a little at a time. We can only unearth a little at a time, but it's this, again, this wrestling, this push and pull, this curiosity, this hope, this seeking, this thirsting for God, and saying, if I keep digging in there, if I keep having this inner dialogue, if we keep going, I'm going to get to that place in my soul where God is, and I'm going to have this conversation with God, and I'm going to ask God some of these questions. That's a healthy inner dialogue. Now, some of you might still feel strange about it. There is a big stigma about talking to yourself. Now, I do highly recommend actually talking to yourself out loud sometimes. You don't have to do that, but let me give you two more reasons to do it, or two reasons why it's not just crazy. One is a theological reason. We believe as Christians that God is somehow one God in relationship with God's self. God is three in one. God is Trinity. And so if God is constantly in relationship with God's self, then why would we be embarrassed to be in dialogue within ourselves too? Jesus himself, when we look at Jesus, you see him on the night of his arrest, and he's saying, on one hand, God, let this cup pass from before me, and on the other hand, yet not as I will, but as thou wilt. Those are different parts of Jesus in dialogue within himself and with God. On the cross, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And also he says, into your hands I commend my spirit. These are different parts of Jesus' experience that he is allowing to have voice, to be in conversation with each other, and again, to be in conversation with his Father. So theologically, we see this happening, not just in the Psalms, but in the life of Jesus and in the divine Trinitarian life. But the second other reason I want to give you is that experientially, we know that there are different parts of us, right? When we have any experience, we're seeing something, we're hearing something, and those can be divergent experiences. Sometimes I think of the food. There's this kind of trend, kind of this fun thing that some people do, where they'll make one food look like another food, right? So you might have it looks like a cupcake, but it's actually like meatloaf with mashed potatoes on it. And they make, you know what I'm saying? And so you'll have these divergent experiences of your senses, right? There's different parts of you. You're seeing one thing, you're tasting another thing. But beyond that, you have your intellect that might be telling you one thing, whereas the voices from your family, your parents, might be telling you something else. The voices of your culture that are in you might be saying something else. You might have a desire that you want to listen to. We have this image of the angel and the devil on our shoulders. Each, the one saying, eat that donut, the other saying, no, you shouldn't, right? We have these different parts of ourselves. We know what that's like. And these different parts of us each have something to say. They each have wisdom. They each have perspective. And so it is a healthy thing for us to let these different parts of us, these different voices within us, sit around a table and discern what is truest and deepest and best. To put these voices together and say, what do all these voices mean about who I am and how I can live? And to consciously, because sometimes these are the voices that can get lost, to consciously give those deeper parts of us a voice. Because oftentimes those deep voices, my soul, when he says, why are you downcast, oh my soul? Those deeper voices are the least pushy and the least loud. And we need to give them space to speak within this inner conversation. And so as we call up the lessons of the past year and ask, what is essential moving forward? Maybe we've learned to be alone with ourselves. And maybe we've developed a healthy inner dialogue. And that is something to carry forward regardless of what the future looks like. Or maybe we've simply learned over the past year, or maybe in this moment you're realizing what lengths we will go to avoid being with ourselves and having that inner conversation. All the things we'll do to fill that space with voices and with projects and with tasks. Maybe that's what we've learned over the past year. But whether we're cut off from physical contact and the church building again or not, let's learn this lesson and prepare for those times when we are physically isolated or just feel isolated from God and from other people, when we're not connecting, when we feel parched or drowning. Let's prepare for those moments. And let's learn to talk to ourselves, to know that we can be our own conversation partner when it seems like no one else is listening, and that those inner conversations can actually lead us to faith, hope, and an ability to experience the love of God within us. And for the very sake of community, that it's good for us to have these conversations so that we don't do damage to the communities that we're a part of. So we're going to practice that right now. We're going to do a meditation that's based on this psalm and this idea of the inner dialogue. And for this exercise, you might want to get a pen and a piece of paper. And so you can pause the video or the audio right now, and you can go get those things. I would encourage you to do that. And I'm going to ask you the same question twice, all right? Or I'm going to invite you to ask the same question twice. And so the first thing I want you to think about right now is I'm going to ask you this question. What do you need to do this week? What do you need to do this week? And I want you to just take a moment, and again, you can pause the video and just make a list on your paper or in your mind of what you need to do this week. Now, I imagine a lot of you came up with a list of tasks. I know mine is a long list of tasks that I need to do this week, especially because we're moving houses, not moving churches, but moving houses. So my list of tasks is long this week. And that's probably what came to mind when I asked you, what do you need to do this week? But now, I want you to ask your soul, right? Okay, so that deepest part of you. I want you to ask your soul, what do you need to do this week? Now I imagine you're going to have a very different list or a very different kind of conversation right now. And so again, pause the video, just take a few moments and listen to your soul as you ask your soul, what do you need to do this week? Was there a difference in those conversations or in those lists? What did your soul tell you about what you need this week? That's the inner dialogue. All right, we're going to try this again with a different question. You can write it down though too. I'm going to ask you, now don't jump ahead because you kind of know what's coming, but don't jump ahead. If I just asked you, what would make for a good week? All right, now you can take a minute and you can write those things down or collect them in your head. What would make for a good week in the coming 7 days? Okay, you have your list now, I hope. And I imagine, if you didn't look ahead too much and cheat in this little exercise, you probably have a list of, a lot of things that you need these things to go right. You want these things to go right? Like you want all green lights when you're going somewhere. You want the test from the doctor's office to come back in a healthy way. You need this person to call you back, or you need this person to do this thing for you, right? When we think about that question, those are the kinds of things we often think about. Now, ask your soul. Soul, what would make for a good week for us? What would make for a good week? Take a moment and process, have that inner conversation with yourself. Was that a different conversation? Okay. I'm going to give you now 4 questions that you can ask your soul throughout the day. Maybe you want to do one each day over the next week or the coming days, and have these conversations with your soul within you. And again, let your body be a part of this conversation, your senses, let your gut, let your soul, let your mind, let your whole self be a part of these conversations and see the different angles, the different perspectives that exist even within yourself. All right, so here are the 4 questions. What is bringing us life right now? What are we grieving right now? What do we most deeply need right now? Where are we finding hope? I phrase those questions as we's, not as we as a church or we as a family, but we as all of the different parts of ourselves. That is who's having this conversation as you reflect on these questions. Friends, may your thirsty souls find streams of living water. May you find the voice of God in the community of wisdom within your being. And may your words, your thoughts, your actions become refreshing oases to your neighbors wandering in the dry land. Go in peace. May Christ be with you.